The palace gates had not opened for a great wolf in 500 years. They opened now. She rode the largest veil, whose shoulders were level with the palace's second-floor windows, whose coat was the specific silver of snow and moonlight, whose eyes were the amber of something older than the kingdom by several centuries. She rode him without saddle, without bridle, her hands resting on the ridge of his neck the way hands rested on a surface that had chosen to carry them. Behind her, 22 great wolves came through the gates in the specific unhurried way of things that had not needed to hurry for 5 centuries and were not starting now. The assembled court watched from the palace steps. King Soren watched from the top of them. 11 weeks ago, he had stripped her rank in front of these same witnesses and ordered her removed from the pack. She looked at him across the courtyard, and the distance between them was the exact distance between what he had made of her and what she had made of herself. This started 11 weeks ago. Let me tell you how. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Kale had been managing the pack's Northern Territory records for 11 years. Not the prestigious records, not the lineage documentation, or the formal treaty archives that the senior administrators kept in the palace's main hall with the specific visible importance of work that was seen by people who mattered. She managed the operational records, the resource allocation logs, the seasonal migration data for the border settlements, the water rights documentation for the 17 communities in the kingdom's northeastern quadrant, the pack bond registry for approximately 4,000 wolves who lived beyond the immediate palace territory and whose bond health was tracked through a system that she had redesigned in her 3rd year because the previous system had been producing errors that no one else had noticed. Nobody had noticed the errors before she fixed them. Nobody had noticed the fix either. She had understood, somewhere in the 2nd year of the work, that the specific invisibility of her role was structural rather than personal, that she occupied a category of administrative work that the pack's hierarchy had decided was maintenance rather than contribution, functional rather than skilled. The kind of thing that happened rather than the kind of thing that people did. She was not invisible because of anything she had done or failed to do. She was invisible because the work she did was the kind of work that only became visible when it stopped being done. She had made her peace with this, or something that resembled peace at a functional level. What she had not made peace with was the accumulation of 11 years of watching decisions be made on the basis of information that was wrong, and having the correct information, and having no channel through which to provide it without violating the specific hierarchical protocol that governed who could speak to whom in which context. The council session had been on a Tuesday. The senior pack member, Lord Casvin, had been presenting a resource allocation assessment for the northeastern quadrant's winter preparation. Kale had been in the room in her capacity as the record keeper for the session, a role that required her presence and required her silence, which was the specific combination that had always seemed designed to produce the maximum frustration for the minimum political liability. Casvin's assessment had been wrong, not nuanced, not open to interpretation wrong. The water rights documentation for 3 of the northeastern communities showed a specific allocation error that would, if the assessment was implemented, redirect resources away from the communities that would need them most during the winter months and toward communities that had sufficient reserves. The error was not malicious. It was the result of working from a previous version of the resource map that Kale had corrected in her 3rd year. Casvin was working from the version that predated her correction. She had the correct documentation in the folder on the table in front of her. She had brought it specifically in case it was needed. She had watched Casvin present the incorrect assessment for 11 minutes. She had watched Soren begin to nod in the specific way he nodded when he was moving toward ratification. She had watched the correct answer sit in a folder in front of her for 11 minutes without anyone asking for it. She had opened the folder and said, "The water rights documentation for those communities was updated in the 3rd year of King Soren's administration. The current allocation map shows a different distribution." The room had gone very quiet. Casvin had turned to look at her with the specific expression of a senior pack member encountering something he had decided was not supposed to be there. Soren had looked at her for a long moment. She had said, "The corrected documentation is in the session record. The allocation Casvin has described would redirect winter resources away from the communities with the greatest deficit." Soren said, in the voice he used for formal decisions, "A record keeper does not address the council without being addressed." She had said, "No, my lord. But 4,000 wolves will have insufficient winter resources if the assessment is implemented from the incorrect map." The council session had ended. The formal rank stripping had been conducted the following morning, in front of the assembled court, with the specific theatrical thoroughness of a performance designed to be instructive. Soren had done it himself, had spoken the formal words, had removed the administrative seal she wore, had announced her removal from the pack with the specific finality of someone who was communicating a message to an audience wider than the person in front of him. The message was, "This is what happens when Omegas speak out of turn." She had stood in the center of the court with her hands at her sides and had let the performance happen because stopping it was not available to her. She had looked at Soren once, in the middle of the formal words, and what she had seen in his face was not cruelty, something almost worse. The specific absence of doubt of a man who was entirely certain he was doing the necessary thing. She had left before noon. She had taken nothing except the coat on her back and the knowledge she had always carried, which was the only thing that had never been conditional on her rank. She had been 8 years old when she found the archive room. The palace's restricted archive was on the 3rd level of the eastern wing, behind a door that was not locked. Why lock a door that no one without proper rank would presume to open? She had been 8 and small, and invisible in the specific way that small, low-ranked children were invisible in palace spaces. And she had been looking for the records room where her mother worked, and had taken a wrong corridor and found a door that was not locked. She had gone in. The room was not large. It held approximately 200 documents in varying states of preservation. She had not known what most of them contained. She had picked up the nearest accessible one and found it was a tax assessment from 300 years ago and had put it back. She had worked her way along the shelf until she found a text that was different from the others in format and in age-bound, not in the palace's standard administrative binding, but in something older and darker and warmer to the touch, with a title on the cover that she read 3 times to make certain she was reading it correctly. The True Names of the Sleeping, a complete record of the 23 great wolves and the covenant by which they rest. She had sat on the archive room's floor and read it for 2 hours. The text was precise in the way of things written by people who understood that imprecision could be catastrophic. It described the great wolves not as myth, not as legend, but as documented entities whose 23 individual names were recorded in full, with pronunciation guides and the specific tonal qualities that made each name recognizable to the wolf it named. It described the covenant, that the great wolves had agreed to sleep as a gift to the kingdom's founding generation, whose wars had exhausted the land, and that they would wake when a speaker who knew their names correctly called them, not compelled them, called them. The distinction was explicit. True name speech was not command. It was recognition. The great wolves could choose not to answer. They never had, when called correctly, because being known completely was the one thing that beings of that depth could not refuse. She had understood, sitting on the archive floor, that she was reading something she was not supposed to be reading. She had memorized all 23 names before she left. She had made 2 more visits to the archive in the following month, each time finding her way back through the wrong corridor route that had produced the first visit. And by the end of the 3rd visit, she had the complete text committed to memory with the specific thoroughness of a child who had understood that she would not be able to return after she was old enough for her presence in those corridors to be noticed. The archive door had been properly locked after that. She had never found out whether someone had noticed her visits or whether it was coincidental. It had not mattered. She had what she needed. She had carried the 23 names for 20 years. She had not spoken them. She had practiced the tonal qualities internally, in the specific way that musicians practiced intervals without producing sound, maintaining the precision of what she had memorized without activating it. She had not consciously planned to use the names. She had not consciously planned not to use them. They had simply been there, the most significant thing she owned, which was also the thing that she had owned longest, and that had never been taken from her because no one knew she had it. The gift at its lower level had been with her for as long as she could remember. The specific quality of her relationship with animals, the way that they responded to her voice with the specific trust of recognized beings. Working dogs that had been wary of everyone came to her easily. Horses that had not been handled in months stood quietly when she spoke to them. She had always attributed this to patience and consistency, had not connected it to the 23 names she carried or the archive text she had read at 8. She understood the connection now, in the mountain air, with the first name she had spoken still vibrating in the stone beneath her feet. The mountains had been pulling her since childhood. She understood this too now. She had run north because north was the direction the mountains were in. This was the complete logic of it. There had been no plan, no destination beyond away from, no resource assessment for the journey she was beginning. She had walked through the palace's outer gates and turned north because the mountains had been pulling her for 20 years, and she had been managing the pull towards something more immediately practical. And the thing that had required the practical management had just been taken from her, and there was nothing left to pull against. The first day was walking. The second day was the specific difficult walking of someone who had not slept and had not eaten adequately, and was moving through terrain that became progressively more demanding as the foothills began. She ate what she could find. She had enough wilderness knowledge from the administrative records she had maintained to know what was safe and what wasn't. She slept in the shelter of a rock formation on the second night and woke in the dark and lay there for a long time with the full weight of the rank stripping in her chest. The third day she reached the mountain's lower slopes. She had heard the mountains described as ancient, which everything sufficiently old was described as in ways that had stopped meaning anything. Standing at their base in the first morning light, she understood that ancient was not decoration. The mountains had a specific quality of age that she felt in her body, the particular resonance of stone that had been here before the kingdom and would be here after it, that had witnessed the original covenant and had been holding the great wolves sleep in their granite structure for 500 years. She climbed through the third day and into the evening. She was not thinking about the names when she began to speak the first one. She was thinking about 11 years and a corrected water rights map and the expression on Soren's face when he had spoken the formal stripping words "not cruel." Not uncertain, the specific expression of a man doing a necessary thing, which was the most devastating possible expression for that moment because it meant he had not doubted. She had said, "You should not have done that." Not to Soren, he was not there. To the mountain. To the dark. To the specific accumulated weight of 20 years of being correct and invisible and managed and finally, publicly disposed of. She had said, "I memorized those names when I was 8 years old, and I never used them because I was always waiting to be in a situation where I had enough standing to justify it." She had said, "I do not have any standing." She had said, "I have nothing except what I have always had." She had said Vale's name. Not quietly, not the internal practice of 20 years, the actual sound of it. In the specific tonal quality the archive text had described. With the complete precision of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for 20 years without knowing she was rehearsing it. The name went into the mountain air, and it did not dissipate. It found something. She felt it find something, the specific resonance of a true name reaching its named entity and being recognized. The mountain shook. Not a tremor, a deliberate movement, the specific quality of something enormous waking from very deep sleep. The stone under her feet vibrated with the frequency of a being reorienting after centuries of stillness. And then, 30 meters above her on the slope, 2 amber eyes opened. The eyes were amber, and they were the size of her torso. She stood on the mountain slope and looked up at them and felt, for the first time since leaving the palace, something other than grief and cold and the specific exhausted determination of a person who had run out of options. What she felt was the specific quality of being looked at by something that saw her completely, not her rank, not her administrative position, not her 11 years of invisible work, not the formal words of the stripping ceremony. The thing looking at her was reading her at a level below all of that. Vale moved. He was larger than she had imagined, and she had imagined something very large. The archive text had described the great wolves as the largest living beings in the known world, and the known world's largest living beings in every other context had been the great bears of the Eastern Territories, which were enormous. Vale made the great bears seem like a different category of scale entirely. He moved with the specific deliberateness of something that had not moved in 5 centuries and was reacquainting itself with the mechanics of movement, not slow, not uncertain, deliberate, the way that beings of significant power moved when they were choosing rather than reacting. He came to her. He stopped with his nose approximately 1 foot from her face and regarded her with the amber eyes that carried 5 centuries of sleep and whatever dreams beings like him had during sleep, and she regarded him back. She did not speak. She had spoken his name, and he had come, and everything that needed to be said by the name had already been said. What was happening now was the specific assessment that followed recognition, the named being, confirming that the one who had spoken the name knew it well enough to deserve what the name opened. She had memorized his name at 8. She had carried it for 20 years. She had spoken it in grief on a mountainside after being stripped of the only institutional identity she had possessed. She did not think she had ever been more completely herself than in this moment. Vale lowered his head. Not submission, acknowledgement. The specific gesture of a sovereign entity acknowledging another sovereign entity, which was what the true name covenant produced. Not a bond of master and servant, but a bond of equals who had found each other across 5 centuries of waiting. She placed her hand on the bridge of his nose. The warmth was extraordinary, not body heat, but something older. The specific warmth of a thing that had been holding power in stillness for 500 years and was now choosing to release it. It moved through her palm and up her arm, and she felt the gift respond the full depth of it, the level she had never accessed before. The true name resonance operating at its maximum depth for the first time since she was 8 years old and reading on an archive floor. She understood, in that moment, what the archive text had meant by covenant. It was not an agreement. It was a mutual recognition. Vale was not hers. She was not his. They were two beings who had found each other at the level below rank and position and institutional standing. And the finding was what the covenant was made of. She said, "There are 22 more." Vale looked at her with the amber eyes. She understood, from the quality of his attention, that he was aware of the others, that the great wolf's sleep was a collective state, that her speaking of one name had begun a disturbance through all 23 that would not resolve until she had spoken them all. She turned to face the mountain above her. She began. She spoke through the night. Each name required its full attention, not just the sounds, which she had maintained with practiced precision for 20 years, but the complete inhabiting of the name's tonal quality that the archive text had described as the difference between reading a name and speaking it. She had to be fully present for each one. She had to mean each name in the specific way that the true name gift required, not performing meaning, not trying to produce it, but the genuine inhabiting of recognition, the acknowledgement of a being at the level of their deepest nature. 23 names, 23 beings, 23 moments of something ancient becoming present. The second was Mira, whose coat was black with the specific depth of a night sky between stars, whose eyes were silver, who came down the slope already fully awake in the way of a being who had been sleeping lightly and had been waiting for a name she half remembered. The third was Dusk, whose coat shaded from gray at the spine to white at the paws, who woke with the specific quality of someone returning from a dream they were not entirely finished with. By the fifth name, the mountain was continuously vibrating. By the 10th, the sky had lightened in the east, and she could see the assembled wolves behind and below her, a gathering of enormous, ancient, entirely awake beings who were watching her speak names with the specific attention of people watching something significant and knowing it was significant. She was exhausted in the way of someone who had been on a mountain for 3 days and had not slept adequately, and was also doing the most sustained use of a gift she had never fully opened before. She kept speaking. The exhaustion was real, and it was irrelevant. The names were more important than her tiredness, and she had always known how to prioritize correctly. The 23rd was Lore's smallest of the great wolves, though smallest still meant considerably larger than any non-great creature, whose coat was a warm brown, the color of old wood, who woke last and lay quiet for a long moment, and then looked at Kale with the specific expression she would later describe as the look of someone who had expected to wait longer. She spoke the last syllable of Lore's name, and the mountain went still. 23 great wolves were awake on the slopes of the ancient range, and she was standing among them with the dawn light coming gold across the stone, and her hands trembling slightly from the sustained gift use, and her chest so full of something she did not have a word for that she had to stand with it for a moment before she could move. Vale came to stand beside her. The others oriented toward her, not submission. The specific acknowledging orientation of sovereign beings who had found their equal. She was the axis of the gathering without being its authority. The distinction mattered to her. She sat down on the mountain stone. She looked at 23 great wolves in the morning light. She thought, I was 8 years old and I read a forbidden book. She thought, I have been carrying this for 20 years. She thought, I do not know what comes next, but I know it is not the palace I left. The news reached the palace in 2 parts. The first part arrived from the northern border settlements on a Thursday morning. 11 weeks into Kale's absence, which was not how the administrative record described her departure, but it was the accurate description of when she had left and what had happened since. The border report described an emergence along the northern valley line. Something old and large and wrong-natured moving through the territories, producing in its path the specific damage that the kingdom's conventional pack forces were entirely unable to address. Not because the forces were inadequate in any conventional military sense. Because the threat was not a conventional military thing. Soren received the report in council. He read the description 3 times. Then he went to the palace archive, the restricted one, which he had access to in his administrative capacity, and he pulled the founding documents for the Northern Territories, and he found what the border settlement's description was pointing toward. He found the ancient records of the original covenant with the great wolves. He found the specific section that described the conditions under which the covenant had been established, the threat the founding generation had faced, which had been the reason they had needed the Great Wolves Agreement in the first place. The threat had returned. He sat with the founding documents for a long time. The second part of the news arrived on the same Thursday afternoon. From the mountain watch post that monitored the ancient range's seismic activity as a standard administrative function that had been running for 2 centuries without ever reporting anything except routine geological measurements. The watch post's report stated that the mountain range had been in continuous low-level seismic activity for 3 days, and that as of this morning the activity had ceased, and that the watch post's observer had counted, through the long-range instruments, 23 shapes on the mountain's upper slopes that were not geological formations and were not present in any previous observation record. Soren put the 2 reports side by side. He had stripped Kale's rank 11 weeks ago. He had done it publicly for an audience to communicate a message about hierarchical protocol. He had done it because Casman had been politically important and the council session had needed a resolution that preserved the political relationship and demonstrated the king's authority. He had done it to a woman who apparently had the great wolves' names memorized. He did not think about this in terms of irony or consequence initially. He thought about it in terms of immediate practical reality. The northern threat required the great wolves, who were answering to Kale, who was on a mountain range 3 days hard, riding from the palace, who had every rational reason to let the kingdom manage its own crisis. He went to find the fastest horse in the stable. He did not take an escort. He rode for 2.5 days. He had not slept on the journey except for the hours when the horse required rest. He had time to think, which was not entirely what he would have chosen. He had been doing a specific kind of thinking for 11 weeks, the kind that had kept the council session and the rank stripping in the compartment of necessary decisions rather than the compartment of decisions requiring re-examination. The journey did not allow that compartmentalization. The journey was 3 days of riding toward a woman he had publicly removed from the pack, in circumstances that had been produced by his own decision, carrying a request that he had no right to make. He thought about the council session. He had not read the corrected water rights documentation after the session ended. He had asked Casvin's assessment whether the allocation was sound, and Casvin had confirmed it was, and he had ratified the allocation and moved on. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. He had ratified an allocation from an uncorrected map because the person who had tried to tell him about the correction had been removed before she could finish explaining. He had checked 2 weeks after the rank stripping because something about the session had remained in a specific uncomfortable category in his administrative memory. He had found the corrected documentation in the session record exactly where she had said it was. He had revised the allocation quietly, through a subsequent administrative process that had not required any acknowledgement of why the revision was necessary. 4,000 wolves had adequate winter resources because he had corrected the allocation. 4,000 wolves had adequate winter resources because she had spoken in the council session. He had punished her for speaking and then implemented the outcome she had spoken about. He was riding toward her to ask her to use the most significant gift he had ever encountered to address a threat to the kingdom he had removed her from. He was constructing the conversation in his head as he rode, and every version he constructed was inadequate in specific and different ways. There was no version of this conversation that was not a man who had stripped a woman's rank, publicly asking her to do something that could save his kingdom. There was no framing that changed what that was. He stopped constructing versions and rode. The mountain was visible by the afternoon of the second day, the ancient range, dark and significant against the sky. And on its upper slopes something that the long range I confirmed was not geological formation. He stopped the horse for a moment and looked. 23 shapes on the mountain. She had done it. She had gone to the mountain with nothing except 20-year-old memorized names, and she had woken the great wolves. He rode on. She heard him before she saw him, not with the true name gift, simply with the ordinary hearing of someone who had been on a quiet mountain for several days and could distinguish between geological sound and the specific rhythmic sound of a horse on the lower approach path. She was sitting at the mountain's third plateau with Vale beside her and 12 of the other wolves, distributed across the slope in their various states of reacquaintance with wakefulness. She had been there for 4 days now. She had eaten what she could find and had slept in the warmth of Vale's side, which was the most adequately warm shelter she had ever occupied, and had been spending the time that was not eating or sleeping in the specific extensive conversation that 20 years of shared names produced between a true name speaker and the beings she had named. She saw Soren before he saw her. He came up the lower path on a horse that was tired from 2.5 days of hard riding, and he came alone, which she noted immediately because the specific absence of escort told her something about the quality of his coming. A king on official kingdom business came with escort. A man who understood he was not coming on official kingdom business came alone. He stopped his horse at the plateau's lower edge. The wolves noticed him. All 23 of them became aware of his presence. Simultaneously, she could feel it as a shift in the distributed attention of the beings she was in covenant with. The specific orientation that sovereign entities produced when something entered their space. They did not move toward him. They did not move away from him. They assessed him with the complete, unhurried attention of beings who had been alive for a very long time and did not find most things particularly urgent. Vale remained beside her and did not go to meet Soren. Soren came up the path on foot. He had left the horse below. He came through the last section of the approach and stopped when he reached the plateau and saw her. She looked at him. He looked at her. The last time they had been in the same space, he had been speaking formal stripping words, and she had been standing in the center of the assembled court with her hands at her sides. The dynamics of that space were entirely absent here. The mountain did not have assembled courts. The mountain had 23 great wolves and a woman who had woken them and a king who had ridden. 2.5 days without an escort to stand on a plateau looking at her with an expression she did not have a prior category for. He said, "May I approach?" She said, "You already have." He said, May I sit?" She said, "The mountain doesn't belong to me." He sat on the stone approximately 4 feet from where she was sitting and looked out at the slope. Below them for a moment in the specific way of someone locating themselves before attempting a conversation. Vale looked at him, not threateningly, the specific neutral assessment she had come to understand as his version of waiting. Soren said, "The Northern Territories have a problem." She said, "I know. The wolves have been in contact with what's moving through the Northern Valley since yesterday." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You know about it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And?" She said, "And I am asking what you came here to say." She said it in the specific tone that was not hostile, but was not accommodating either, the tone of someone who had given 11 years of service to an institution and had been publicly stripped of it, and was now sitting on a mountain with 23 great wolves, and was entirely capable of waiting. He said, "I came to say that I was wrong." She waited. He said, "About the council session, about the rank stripping." He said it with the quality of someone who had been sitting with this for 2.5 days of writing and had not found a better way to start than the direct statement. She said, "And the northern threat?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You were wrong and you need the great wolves." He said, "Yes to both." He said, "I am not trying to connect them. I know they are two separate things." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Ask me what you came to ask." He said, "The northern threat is the same thing that the original covenant was established to address." She said, "I know. Vale told me." He looked at Vale. He said, "He told you?" She said, "We have a covenant. Communication is part of it." She paused. She said, "What you are asking is whether the wolves will go north." He said, "Yes." She said, "And whether I will bring them?" He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the slope below the plateau, the wolves distributed across it, awake and present and absolutely themselves. She thought about the Northern Territories and the 4,000 wolves she had maintained records for, in the allocation she had corrected that he had subsequently ratified. She thought about the people in those territories who had adequate winter resources because she had spoken in a council session and been stripped of rank for it. She said, "The wolves will go north." She said it plainly. She said, "I am not going to let 4,000 people be harmed by a threat that the wolves can address because I have a grievance with the person who is asking." She said, "That would be a different kind of wrong than the one you committed, and I am not willing to commit it." He said, "I know that." She said, "Do you?" He was quiet. She said, "The reason I know you know that is because you came alone." She said, "You came without escort and without the specific political framing of an official mission, and without anything that would make this look like a kingdom resource being mobilized rather than a man coming to say something to a woman he wronged. She said, that was the correct way to come. He said, I was not certain it was. She said, it was. He said, will you tell me? She stopped and started again. She said, I want to understand what I did, not to revise it, to understand it correctly. She said, you performed the rank stripping for an audience. She said, you were not punishing a procedural violation. You were communicating to the court what happened to Omegas who spoke accurately in front of senior pack members and embarrassed them. She said, I was the example, not the subject. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of receiving something rather than deflecting it. She said, the information I provided was correct. He said, the allocation was revised 2 weeks later. She said, I know. He said, I did not announce why it was revised. She said, I know that too. He was quiet for a longer moment. He said, I am sorry for that specifically. He said, not only for the rank stripping, but for ratifying the corrected information without. He stopped. He said, without acknowledging it. She received this. She did not tell him it resolved the accounting, because it did not resolve the accounting. She said, I receive it. A runner reached the plateau's lower edge, a palace runner. Exhausted and young, and looking at the wolves with the specific expression of someone who had been prepared for their presence intellectually, and was finding the actual presence considerably more significant than the preparation had suggested. The runner said, the northern settlement has requested urgent response. He said, the threat has reached the valley floor. She and Soren returned to the palace with the wolves in 3 days. The political situation that was waiting for her arrival was, she had been informed by a second runner who had caught up with them on the second day of return travel, characterized by a faction of the council that had been preparing for this exact scenario since the Mountain Watch Post report had been filed. Lord Casvan's faction. The argument was 4 parts. That the Great Wolf's awakening had been accomplished through irregular means. A woman who had been formally removed from the pack had accessed a sacred resource through knowledge that had been restricted precisely to prevent unauthorized use. That the covenant obtained under these conditions was not the kingdom's covenant, but Kale's personal covenant. And the kingdom could not be obligated by a personal arrangement made by someone who was not a pack member. That accepting the Great Wolf's assistance on Kale's terms represented a capitulation to the specific kind of behavior the rank stripping had been designed to deter. And that the kingdom's security could not be held hostage to the political demands of a removed administrator. The argument was wrong in specific and documentable ways. Which was its advantage. It was wrong in the ways that required her to be present to disprove it, which was the specific position Casvan's faction wanted her in, inside the palace's political space, on the faction's terms, accountable to the institutional framework that had previously removed her. Soren read the faction's formal submission on the second day of return travel. He was quiet for a long time after reading it. He said, they are trying to make your presence conditional on accepting the legitimacy of the rank stripping. She said, yes. He said, they cannot do that. She said, they can try to do it. She said, what they are actually doing is trying to make your acceptance of the covenant conditional on theirs. She said, the covenant is not with the council or with the faction. It is with me and with you as king. He said, yes. She said, the question is whether you are going to let the council define the terms of your own covenant. He said, no. She said, Then what you need to decide is whether to address the faction before we arrive or after. He said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "Before." She said, "Arrive with the question already answered and the wolves already committed to the northern response." She said, "Let the faction's objections be to a decision already made rather than to a decision in process." He said, "The northern response." She said, "The wolves will go north tomorrow morning." He said, "With you?" She said, "With me." She said, "Vale and 4 others. The remaining 18 will come to the palace." He said, "The faction will say the 18 are an occupying force." She said, "The faction can say what they want about beings that have been in this kingdom longer than the kingdom has existed." She said, "The great wolves are not an occupying force. They are the original treaty partners." She said, "I suggest you remind the council of that distinction before I arrive." He sent a rider ahead with instructions that evening. On the 3rd day of return travel, as the palace came into view on the horizon, and the 18 wolves distributed themselves across the landscape in the specific way of beings that were absolutely certain of their welcome, because they had been welcoming this land since before it had a name, Casvan's faction submitted a formal ultimatum. The king must choose between recognizing the covenant with Kale or maintaining the council's authority. Soren read the ultimatum. He said, "They are making this easier than I expected." She said, "They frequently do when they feel cornered." He said, "I am going to respond before we reach the gates." She said, "Yes." He sent the rider with his response, which was 3 sentences, and which had a specific quality of brevity that communicated something about how much consideration had been given to the ultimatum's framing. The 3 sentences were, "The covenant stands. The council's authority does not extend to sovereign entities. Lord Casvan is removed from the council pending review." She rode north with Vale and 4 others on the 4th morning. She had not slept much in the days since the mountain. She had not eaten as regularly as the sustained true name gift use required. She was operating on the specific fuel of someone who had found their purpose after 20 years of waiting for the conditions that would allow it, and who was not going to let physical fatigue be the reason those conditions were not met. The Northern Valley was 2 days' hard ride from the palace. She felt the threat before she saw it, the specific quality of something old and wrong-natured in the valley air, a frequency that the great wolves registered in the same way a compass registered magnetic north, directly and without requiring interpretation. Vale's response was the response of a being who had been awoken specifically because of this, not alarm. The specific, purposeful activation of a thing that knew its function. The encounter with the northern threat did not require violence in the conventional sense. The archive text had been specific about this. The Great Wolves' covenant was not military. What they provided was not force, but the specific sovereign frequency of beings whose presence reoriented the fundamental nature of the space they occupied. The thing moving through the Northern Valley was wrong-natured in the sense of being out of its own proper frequency, displaced from wherever it originated, producing damage through its wrongness rather than through malice. Vale walked into the valley with the other 4 great wolves behind him, and he produced, simply by being present and fully himself, the specific resonance of an ancient sovereign being in its proper territory. The 5 of them together produced a frequency that the wrong-natured thing encountered, and she watched this happen from the valley's edge. With the true name gift reading the interaction at its full depth, responded to by finding its own proper frequency again and returning to it. The damage stopped. The valley was quiet. She sat on Vale's back and looked at a valley that had been in crisis 2 days ago and was now simply a valley in the kingdom's northern territory, adequately watered and adequately resourced and monitored by the specific presence of beings who had been in covenant with this land since before it had governance. She thought about 11 years of administrative records and corrected maps. She thought about a forbidden book and 23 names memorized at 8 years old. She thought about what 20 years of patience looked like when you finally stopped managing it. She turned Vale toward the palace. The assembly had gathered before she arrived. Word moved faster than riders when the thing the word described was 23 great wolves appearing on the horizon. And the palace's entire population had organized itself on the courtyard and the steps and the upper windows in the specific way of communities, preparing to witness something that would be described for generations. She could see them from a mile out the assembled court, the palace staff. The wolves already present who had oriented themselves toward her approach in the unhurried way of sovereign beings, who were exactly where they were supposed to be. She rode on Vale at the pace he chose, which was measured and certain. The palace gates opened. They had been opened for her not because anyone could have stopped the great wolves if the gates had been closed, but because someone had made the decision to open them, which was a different kind of statement than being unable to close them. She rode through. The courtyard was quiet in the way that spaces went quiet when the thing happening in them was too significant for ambient noise. Vale's paws on the courtyard stone produced a specific sound, the soft, deliberate impact of enormous paws on ancient stone, each step considered. The 22 other wolves positioned themselves in the specific distributed pattern she had seen them assume when they wanted to communicate presence rather than threat, not surrounding, orienting. The courtyard center was hers and Vale's. Soren was on the palace steps. She looked at him across the courtyard. He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, not the managed assessment of a king evaluating a political situation, the direct, unfiltered attention of a man who was seeing something that could not be categorized through the usual frameworks and was not trying to categorize it. The assembled court was very still. She had stood in this same courtyard 11 weeks ago with her hands at her sides and the formal stripping words in the air around her. She had not run, then she had waited for the ceremony to finish, and then she had walked out with the specific composure of someone who was not going to let the performance have the emotional register it was designed to produce. She had managed herself, as she had always managed herself, within the constraints of the situation. There were no constraints here. She was on Vale's back at the center of the palace courtyard she had been removed from, with 22 great wolves distributed around her, and the northern crisis resolved, and 23 names in her memory that had been waiting 20 years for exactly this. Soren came down the steps. He came down all the steps. Not to the landing, not to the middle, all the way down, across the courtyard, to where Vale had stopped. He came without the command frequency active, which she felt in the specific absence of the ambient signal she had always experienced around alpha authority figures, and which was not active around him now. He came without the council, without escort, without the specific political framing of a king's formal approach to a diplomatic situation. He stopped 6 feet from Vale. Vale regarded him with the amber eyes. He said, "I want to kneel." She said, "It is your choice to make." He said, "I know." He said it with the quality of a man who had been thinking about this for 3 days and had arrived at it as the genuine rather than the political gesture. He said, "I am not doing it for the court. I want you to know that. She said, then do it for what you mean by it. He knelt. The courtyard was absolutely silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of an assembled witness group receiving something they understood was significant and were choosing to receive it fully. He knelt on the courtyard stone that she had walked across 11 weeks ago on the way out, and the great wolves were present on all sides, and the court was watching. And none of it was a performance, because a performance required the performer to be aware of the audience, and he was not looking at the court. He was looking at her. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what kneeling meant and what it did not mean. It was not subordination in the political sense. She was not the kingdom's queen, and he was not abdicating. It was the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood that what the other person carried was not something he had authority over. The great wolves had not knelt to him. They had assessed him and found him neither sovereign nor enemy, and had treated him with the specific courtesy of beings who did not need to perform their power and were waiting to see what he understood. He understood something. She was building the evidence for what it was. She dismounted from Vale. She stood in the courtyard and looked at Soren on the ground before her and said, "Stand up." He stood. She said, "The northern crisis is resolved." She said it in the voice of someone providing accurate information, which was the voice she had always used for accurate information regardless of context or audience. She said, "The wolves will remain in the kingdom as treaty partners per the original covenant's terms." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have requirements for what comes next." She said, "Not as conditions for the great wolves' presence. The covenant is established and is not conditional on my requirements." She said, "As conditions for mine." He said, "Tell me." He addressed the court that evening. She was present, not at the center, not at the position of a supplicant or a subject, at the working table in the council chamber's east position, which was where the pack's senior advisors sat when a full court session was convened. She had not asked for this position. He had indicated it, and she had sat down. He said, 11 weeks ago I stripped rank from a member of this pack's administration in a formal public ceremony. He said, I did this because a senior council member was embarrassed in front of an audience by accurate information, and I chose to resolve the embarrassment through the specific mechanism of punishing the person who had provided the accuracy. He said, the information was accurate. He said, the water rights allocation for the northeastern quadrant was subsequently revised based on the corrected documentation she had referenced in the council session. He said, 4,000 wolves have adequate winter resources because she spoke. He said, I struck her rank and removed her from the pack for providing information that saved 4,000 people's winter. He said, the northern threat that was addressed this week by the great wolves was the same threat that the original covenant was established to address 500 years ago. He said, the names required to call the great wolves were memorized by the woman I removed from this pack when she was 8 years old and reading in the restricted archive. He said, the restricted archive was restricted to prevent exactly this kind of access by exactly this kind of person. He said, the restriction was designed to protect institutional power from the specific kind of knowledge that institutional power cannot use itself and therefore prefers that no one use. He said, the knowledge that we were protecting ourselves from was the knowledge that saved the Northern Territories. He said, the rank stripping was wrong. The removal from the pack was wrong. The ratification of the corrected water rights allocation without acknowledgement of its source was wrong. He said, I am telling you all of this in a formal session, because the wrong was done in a formal session, and the accounting needs to happen in the same place. Lord Casvan said, from the gallery where he had been seated pending review, "The king is allowing himself to be manipulated by." Soren said, "Lord Casvan's presence in this session is under review, and his contributions are not recognized." He said it in the quiet authority that was not command frequency, the specific voice of a man whose certainty was not about compulsion but about clarity. Casvan was quiet. The court was quiet with a different quality, the quality of people who had watched a performance 11 weeks ago and were now watching its accounting, and who were revising something in their understanding of what kind of court they were in. She said, the Covenant Council. She said it in the council chamber the following morning, with Soren and the remaining senior council members present and veil visible through the window in the courtyard, which had the specific effect of making the council's attention somewhat more concentrated than usual. She described it, a permanent body with the constitutional authority to present unfiltered, accurate information at the council level, staffed by practitioners whose specific function was to maintain the distinction between accurate information and information filtered through the council's preference hierarchy. Not an intelligence body, a truth maintenance body. Its authority was to speak in any formal session without being addressed, and without requiring rank in the conventional hierarchy. Its members would be drawn from the kingdom's administrative records, workers, the specific people who had been managing the unglamorous essential work below the threshold of institutional notice for their entire careers. She said, the second requirement. She said, the administrative restoration of rank to every person removed from the pack through what I am calling political performance rank strippings, conducted not for genuine violations, but for the specific purpose of communicating to an audience what happened to people who disrupted the preferred power dynamic. She said, I am aware that defining this category requires judgment. I am also aware that the council is capable of applying that judgment honestly if it chooses to. She said, the third requirement. She said, the great wolves are recognized as sovereign entities with their own standing in the kingdom's governance framework. She said, not assets, not weapons, not resources belonging to the crown. Sovereign treaty partners whose covenant is with the land and with the speaker who woke them, and whose presence in the kingdom is a gift freely given rather than a strategic asset subject to command. She said, I am not presenting these as conditions for the wolves' presence. The covenant is established. She said, I am presenting these as conditions for my presence. He said, all three. She said, without negotiation. He said, without negotiation. She looked at him. She said, I am going to ask you one question before this session concludes. He said, ask. She said, when you removed the allocation error from the record without acknowledging its source, did you tell yourself that was because you did not want to create additional complexity, or did you know what you were doing? He was quiet for a long moment. He said, I knew what I was doing. She said, yes. She said, that is the honest answer, and it is the one I needed. He said, and. She said, and I am still here. She said it with the specific quality of something settled rather than something performing settledness. She said, the evidence I have been building since the mountain is sufficient for me to be still here. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention. He said, I will not ask what that means until you are ready to tell me. She said, it means what it means. She said, you will know what it means when I am ready for you to know. He said, That is acceptable. The Covenant Council was established within the month. She chaired it not because the charter required her to, because she was the person who had designed it and was the person with the clearest understanding of what it was for and the specific practical knowledge of 11 years of administrative work that made her the most competent available candidate. She had not asked whether she should be chair. She had assessed who was most competent and had concluded it was her and had proceeded accordingly. The council's first formal act was the restoration of rank to 17 individuals who had been removed from the pack through the political performance mechanism over the previous 8 years. 12 of them were in the palace's administrative functions. 3 were in the outer territories. 2 had left the kingdom entirely and were located through the specific patient work of the administrative records network that she had been maintaining for 11 years, and that was now, for the first time, being used to find people rather than track resources. The second act was the presentation of unfiltered administrative records to the full Council 7. Reports that had been in the records system for months and had not reached the council level because they had been filtered out by the preference hierarchy. 4 of the 7 required immediate action. 1 of them required a policy reversal. The Covenant Council presented all 7 without softening. The full council received them. There was friction. The friction was addressed through the specific mechanism that the Covenant Council's charter provided. The accurate information stayed in the record regardless of whether the council found it comfortable. Vale came to the palace gardens in the evenings. This had not been specified in the Covenant's terms, it had simply become Vale's practice. Appearing at the garden's western edge as the light changed, and settling there with the patient permanence of a being that understood it was now permanently present in this space, and was becoming familiar with its features. Soren had encountered Vale in the garden on the 3rd evening, and had stood at a respectful distance, and after a while Vale had come to him, which she had been told about the following morning, and which had told her something specific about Vale's assessment of the situation. She came to the garden on the 5th evening, and found both of them there. She sat on the garden bench, and Vale was on one side of her, and Soren was on the other, and the evening light was the specific gold of an autumn evening in a kingdom that had managed a crisis, and was now trying to understand what it had become. He said, "May I ask now?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What did you mean when you said the evidence was sufficient?" She said, "I meant what I always mean when I say something." She said, "I carry a gift that lets me know when things are true." She said, "The things I have been watching you do for the past several weeks are true." She said, "You read the documents yourself. You went to the mountain alone. You addressed the council directly. You acknowledged to my face that you knew what you were doing when you removed the record correction without attribution." She said, "Those are the specific behaviors of a person who is choosing accuracy over comfort, which is the only behavior I know how to value." He said, "And?" She said, "And the gift that lets me know when things are true is telling me that this is." She said it the way she said all true things plainly, without decoration, in the register of accurate information rather than performance. He said, "That is the most precise declaration I have ever received." She said, "I am a precise person." 3 years forward, the Covenant Council had reviewed 408 records in 3 years and had presented 93 of them to the full council as requiring action. Of the 93, 71 had produced immediate administrative response. 14 had produced policy changes. 8 had produced the specific rare outcome of complete reversals of standing decisions. All 408 were in the permanent record accessible to any citizen who requested access. The restricted archive was open. She had made this the fourth requirement not mentioned in the formal session, but presented in a subsequent administrative proposal that Soren had approved without requiring a second proposal. The archive's contents were cataloged and available to scholarly access under a responsible use framework that she had written and that had been in operation for 2 years without producing any of the catastrophic misuse that the original restriction had been designed to prevent. The forbidden book had been read by 27 scholars, 4 of whom were 8-year-old children attending the kingdom's new administrative education program, a program whose existence she had not asked for directly, but whose curriculum she had designed when Soren had asked what the kingdom needed most, and she had said, "People who can read the important things." The great wolves were present. Not uniformly, not constantly, they moved between the mountain range and the kingdom's territories in the specific unhurried pattern of beings whose presence was distributed across a geography they understood as theirs. Vale spent the most time at the palace. The others came and went with the seasons, and their presence was not an event anymore, it was a quality of the kingdom, a permanent feature of the landscape that people had stopped finding remarkable and had started finding ordinary in the specific way that profound things became ordinary when they were consistently present. The Northern Territories had not had another crisis. The Covenant Council had, in its second year, identified the conditions that had produced the original one and had proposed the administrative adjustments that reduced its likelihood of recurrence. The adjustments had been implemented. The territories were being managed now from accurate data. The rank stripping ceremony was no longer available as a governance tool. The charter reform that had removed it had passed the council on a Tuesday morning in the second year, presented by the Covenant Council as a formal recommendation, passed by the full council with 3 abstentions and no votes against. Casvin had not been on the council to vote. Casvin had been the subject of a separate review that had concluded 6 months after the palace gates reopening. Kale stood at the palace's eastern window in the early morning and watched Vale move through the garden below. He was doing the specific thing he did in the mornings, moving through the space with the patient deliberateness of a being familiarizing itself with a territory it now considered home. She had been watching him do this for 3 years and had not stopped finding it significant. Soren came to stand beside her. She said, "The spring review begins today." He said, "I read the preparatory documents last night." She said, "All of them." He said, "All of them." She said, "The Northern Water Allocation revision is in the 3rd set." He said, "I know." He said, "I read that one twice." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden where Vale was moving, and his expression had the quality she had come to associate with him in the mornings, less managed than the council sessions, more present. The version of him that had been becoming more frequent over 3 years of building something together in the specific gradual way that things built from accurate materials became solid. She said, "I have been thinking about something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The Forbidden Book describes the covenant as renewable." She said, "Every generation of true name speakers can renew the covenant with the active great wolves through the same recognition process that established it." She said, "It is not a single generation arrangement." He said, "Which means?" She said, "Which means the names need to be passed on." She said, "I have been thinking about who should carry them next." He said, "You have a candidate." She said, "I have several." She said, "The 8-year-olds in the administrative education program who have been reading the archive materials." She said, "There is one specifically who has been asking questions about the true name text that suggests she may already have some version of the gift at its lower level." He said, "She is 8. She said, "I was 8 when I memorized them." He looked at her. She said, "I am not proposing to send her to a restricted archive." She said, "I am proposing to teach her directly." She said, "Which is what the archive restriction prevented for 500 years and what the archive opening now makes possible." He said, "You want to establish a lineage of true name speakers." She said, "I want to establish a lineage of people who carry the names because they should be carried, not because one 8-year-old was small enough to get into a restricted archive unnoticed." He said, "That is the most Kale statement you have ever made." She said, "I am a consistent person." She looked at Vale below, moving through the garden with the patient permanence of something that had found its home in the kingdom after 5 centuries of waiting. She thought about a forbidden book and 23 names and a mountain at night and grief becoming something else in ancient air. She thought about 4,000 people with adequate winter resources and 17 people whose rank had been restored and 93 records that had been seen by the people who needed to see them. She thought about what it had cost to carry 20 years of names and what it had been worth. She thought, "I was 8 years old and I memorized everything." She thought it was enough. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.